Hello, and welcome to part 2 of my January wrap-up. So previously I did my wrap-up for the Bookworms New Year Readathon. That was part 1 of my January wrap-up. I will link that in the cards and in the description box, so if you would like to check that video out, you can see a good chunk of other books that I read in January. I also have a few books that I read in January that were included in my 12 Days of Bookmas wrap-up. I will also link that in the cards and in the description box below. So before we get into stats, I'm going to do a quick rundown of the books that I talked about in those 2 videos. In the 12 Days of Bookmas wrap-up, I read A Thousand Splendid Suns by Kawaguchi, The Empire of Gold by S.A. Chakraborty, Next by Michael Crichton, and Nzinga, Warrior Queen of Matamba by Patricia C. McKissack. For Bookworms New Year, I read Stiff, The Curious Lives of Human Cadavers by Mary Roach, Before the Coffee Gets Cold by Toshikazu Kawaguchi, Through the Door by Jody McIsaac, Such a Fun Age by Kylie Reed, The Girl with the Louding Voice by Abe Dare, and The Henna Artist by Alka Joshi. Let's just get into some stats while we are sitting here. First things first, I read 18 books for a total of 5,890 pages, though I will say that at least one of the books, I think only one of the books, didn't have a page number specified on the story graph, so you could probably tack on about 500 pages to that. You should see a little pie chart here of the various moods that were represented in the books that I read. It looks like reflective and challenging were 2 of the larger slices. As far as pacing goes, I actually read more slow-paced books this month rather than anything else, which is interesting to me because I think I typically tend to read more like medium-paced books rather than anything. There were 7 books that were considered slow-paced, 6 that were considered medium, and 4 that were considered fast-paced. For page numbers, this is probably about right. I had 6 that were less than 300 pages, 10 that were between 300 and 499 pages, and according to the pie chart, I only had 1 that was over 500 pages, but that, I mean, the numbers just don't add up to 18 there. So I know that the book that they didn't count, like have a page number count for, was over 500 pages. That was The Empire of Gold by S.A. Chakraborty. So I read 2 books that were over 500 pages. I read 16 fiction books and 2 nonfiction this month. Not terribly surprised by that. I'm still kind of recovering from nonfiction November and then just finals at the end of the year, so I'm kind of taking my nonfiction a little bit slower than I might be otherwise. Here is a wonderful list of all the genres that were included in the books that I read. Kind of a lot of them this month. Very thriller and historical heavy, and that's pretty normal for me. And then finally, I had 17 reviews because there's 1 book that I did not rate. We'll get into that shortly. It looks as though, actually 2 books that I didn't rate. Interesting. Okay, 2 books that I didn't rate. 2 that I rated 2 stars, 1 that I rated 2.5 stars. It looks like 3 that were 3 stars, 3 that were 4 stars, and 6 that were 5 stars, which is not bad. My average rating was 3.83 stars. I guess first off, we will run down my list of DNFs. First was Before the Coffee Gets Cold by Toshikazu Kawaguchi. I talked about that in the Bookworms New Year wrap-up, which was part 1 of the January wrap-up. Again, that'll be linked in the description box and in the cards. The second one I DNF'd, and this, I don't know, I'm almost afraid to admit I DNF'd it, sheesh. When No One Is Watching by Alyssa Cole. I know Alyssa Cole is beloved on BookTube, and I read, what's it called, A Princess in Theory, I think, is what the title. It's from the Reluctant Royal series, and I enjoyed that. like a fine book. I don't read a ton of romance, so, you know, for me it was just good. I didn't like this at all. For a number of reasons. First of all, I didn't like the characters. Any of them. Not a single character did I like at all. God, I almost feel bad saying that. Secondly, so I've seen a lot of criticisms that this book is marketed as a thriller, but it's really, like, pacing-wise, reads more like horror. And I can see that from what I did read. I can see that. I'm going to link a couple of Goodreads reviews that, one, they actually read the whole book, so, you know, that's a plus. And two, they have a different viewpoint on the topic than I do. Now, a lot of the things I agree with them on, but just so you can see from people of different backgrounds what they thought about it. Last book I DNF'd, and this one's totally on me. Mistakes were made here. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexander Dumas. First things first, audiobook, terrible idea. Absolutely terrible idea. There are too many characters to keep track of, and listening to it on audiobook was not the way to go. The second mistake I made was that the audiobook was the full unabridged edition, which means it was over 50 hours long. So I got at least halfway through. But that means I still had over 500 pages to read. Or, you know, 25 plus hours. That's a commitment. Especially when you're spending half of it confused because just the sheer number of characters to account for is not working on audio. Now, I know I can handle things like that. Like, I just read Anacaona in December. Also very long, also ton of characters. And I didn't have trouble keeping track of them because when I read, I see the names, I see the spellings, I see the context. So I think for me, audiobook was not the way to go. In the future, because I think I will attempt to reread it, I'm going to go for the abridged edition first. And I'm going to actually read it, like, with my eyes, and see if that makes a difference. Okay, books I did get through, in no particular order. Well, mostly no particular order. I have to talk about this book first because I loved it. The Warmth of Other Suns, The Epic Story of America's Great Migration by Isabel Wilkerson. This book was magnificent. This took me a very, very long time to read, and I will tell you why. First of all, so I started reading this back in November, and the content is very heavy, especially in the beginning of the book, because there's a lot of information about why the particular stories were focused on, why these people left the South to begin with. So there's a lot of violence, and there are a lot of things that are just hard to read about. So it takes some time to digest. So I found myself reading like little sections and then having to put it down for a while to fully ruminate on what I just read. Sometimes if I was already kind of in a down and out mood, I couldn't pick the book up because I knew it was just going to push me further into that like depression, just because the content was just frankly terrible at times. The things that African Americans in the South were going through at this particular point in history was disgusting, frankly. Isabel Wilkerson is a masterful writer. This has got to be one of the best, most engaging nonfiction books I have ever read. What she did was she took the stories of three very different people, different levels of education, they came from different places, they went to different places, and she wrote their stories. But within writing their stories, she would intersperse like the factual information, I guess, just like the basic facts of the migration, how people were leaving, where people were going to, the economic impact, the sociological impact, things of that nature. But it never felt dry at any point ever because she wove it so skillfully in between the different parts of the characters' stories. So we're following Ida Mae Gladney, who immigrated from Mississippi, I believe, initially to Wisconsin and then settled in Chicago. Her story, when she, the part of her story where she got to vote for the first time, just put so much gladness into my heart, because just the way she expressed her happiness and the awe she felt at being able to take part in this very vital part of American politics, it just warmed my heart that she was able to experience that, you know? I adored that. George Starling was an interesting character, and his was a life that it just seemed was filled with disappointments, even after he left Florida and permanently moved to New York. The reasons behind his move was because he was going to be killed. Like, they knew for sure he was going to end up lynched if he didn't get out of the South. He was stirring things up. He was part of like the citrus pickers, and he knew during one of the world wars, I can't remember, I think it was World War II, that the growers needed the pickers more than the pickers needed them. So he would negotiate for more money, and he would tell, you know, his other pickers that no, they're gonna pay us or we're not gonna do this. And it, you know, it worked, and sometimes it didn't, and at the end of the day, though, they'd had enough of his meddling. So he had to leave in order to protect his life. And honestly, like, I just feel like his story was the most depressing out of all of them, because I feel like he never really quite won anything, you know? And then Robert Pershing Foster is the third person whose story we're following, and it's interesting because from a financial and society-based perspective, he came out by far the best. He ended up in California. He was a surgeon, and he was very, very wealthy. However, there was something inside of him. There was this part inside of him. It was like this mental block where nothing was ever quite enough. And it was heartbreaking to read that. But at the same time, it was like the little things, the little wins that just, they were so satisfying, you know? And I don't know, I've never been so gripped by a story in all of my life. It's interesting because her most recent release, Cast, you can kind of see where she started getting the ideas for that book in here. And it's just interesting because she's been working on this book since the 90s. And in this book, I can see the groundwork being laid for Cast. And so, like, that's dedication, in my opinion. And I really can't wait to pick up Cast, because I am very hopeful that it's going to be just as gripping as this was. Okay, the bulk of these next few I don't have as strong of feelings about, so maybe we'll get through them a little bit faster. We have Persuasion by Jane Austen. I didn't rate this. I don't usually rate classics because, quite frankly, they weren't written for me. It was fine. Like, I don't have anything to really complain about. I just don't know if Jane Austen is particularly the author for me. I'm just not sure. Next on my list, I have The Searcher by Tana French. I gave this 3 stars. This was on the Goodreads Choice Awards for the thriller mystery category, and this definitely falls more into mystery than thriller. It's set in a very, very small town in Ireland, which was honestly the best part of it for me. The characters were fine, but overall it was nothing to write home about. I'm actually blanking a lot on the story at this point, which is why I don't have much more to say about it. Next up, I have Long Bright River by Liz Moore. Liz Moore is an author that I really do like. I read The Unseen World by her, and it was phenomenal. Pretty sure I gave that book 5 stars. This one I only gave 4 stars. And to be honest, I can't pinpoint why I only gave it 4 stars. This is just, it's a mystery, but it also kind of tackles some sociological problems, particularly with opioid addiction. Now, this takes place in Philadelphia. My husband was born and raised in Philadelphia, so anytime I read a book that takes place in Philadelphia, I frequently ask him questions about the places mentioned and, you know, whatever. And everything he said lined up with how this book went down, which is really good. I always like it when it seems like the author either is from that place or knows it well enough to write convincingly about it. This was, I don't know, it was just good. It was a story of 2 sisters. One is a cop, one is addicted to opioids, and very interesting dynamic. The opioid addicted one is a sex worker. There's a lot of discussion about corruption in the police force, and then there's also a lot of details about, how do I put this without sounding flip? Essentially like crack babies, like babies who are born already with an addiction problem, and how much harder it is and how much more of a commitment it is to raise a child who is born into the world with that kind of a problem already. So this is really good. I enjoyed this. As far as like from a mystery thriller perspective though, it wasn't super strong, and I think that might be why I rated it like I did. Next we have The Boy from the Woods by Harlan Coben. I didn't really like this. This is another one where I felt like all the characters were more like caricatures. They had like one defining feature, and that was who they were. Not to mention the boy from the woods, like the titular character, we find out like nothing about him, and that's frustrating. I wasn't really satisfied with I wasn't really satisfied with how the mysteries turned out. There were like 3 separate mysteries, kind of all entangled into one thing, and I didn't care for how any of them shook out in the end. I really, like, this was mostly about like really rich people, and I don't care about really rich people. It was a lot about politics, and I am tired of things being overly politicized. I have that in my day-to-day life. Why do I want that in my fiction as well? So this was just a big no for me. I think I gave it 2 stars. Next we have The Haunting of Brynn Wilder by Wendy Webb. I think I gave this one 2 stars as well, although it probably deserves less than that. This reads like a self-published novel in that it's just not very clean. Like, and not clean in the sense that it's explicit content or anything, it's just that it's very messy. There doesn't seem to be one main storyline. It doesn't seem like the book knows what genre it wants to be. It's pitching itself to be like a gothic horror novel, and it is neither of those things. It's really just a love story, and a really crappy love story at that, quite frankly. Next, I actually read this pretty early in the month. It's The Dark Archive by Genevieve Cogman. This is book 7, I think, in the Invisible Library series. I love the Invisible Library series, but this was not the strongest entry in that series. Like, I'm already, I read it this month, and I'm already like scanning the back blurb to even remember what it was about, when there are other books in the series that I read last year that I could still tell you a decent amount about. In this one, Irene, who is our main character throughout the series, she has taken on a new apprentice who is a part of the Fae. It is in an effort to further solidify this treaty between the dragons and the Fae that the library is kind of the mediators on. I just don't know. Like, we had a character that I thought was gone forever crop up again, which was interesting, but ultimately, I didn't care that much. Next, I read another book from the Royal Diary series. This one I'm still trying to clean the cover up a little bit. This is what happens when you buy books used. But this is Anacaona, Golden Flower. It takes place in Haiti in 1490. This book was good. It's hard when you get these royal princesses, if you even want to call them that, because the actual terminology is different from culture to culture. But when they're from very ancient times and places that didn't really have much of a written tradition, they were more of an oral tradition, it can be very difficult to write a story that is compelling and makes you feel attached to the character. And this one kind of suffers from that. However, the historical note and this little section that was like the world of Anacaona was super interesting. It talks about how life kind of was before Christopher Columbus discovered the Americas. Anyway, like during this story, the Europeans actually come into play, and it's just it's an interesting look at that whole dynamic and colonialism. And I really, like I said, I didn't rate this one, but I really loved the historical note, and that alone I think is worth having the book for, frankly. The last book to talk about, Transcendent Kingdom by Gyasi. I ended up giving this 5 stars, which I did not expect to do. There was a time pretty early on when I nearly DNF'd this. Basically because this has a strong religious element to it, and it was really bugging me. But in the end, it actually ended up being more of a therapeutic story for me than anything, and I was easily able to reconcile the religious part of the storyline with the science part of the storyline, and it didn't end like I thought it did, and like I thought it was going to, and that ended up being, for me personally, I think it was a wonderful choice the author made. In this, we're following a woman. Her name is Gifty. She is pretty far into her PhD. She is a neuroscientist, I believe, and she's studying essentially the effects that addiction has on the brain. And there was enough about the science aspect of what she was doing to make me happy and feel like it was legitimately part of the book, rather than just the author not wanting to do any research but wanting to have a woman in STEM in her novel. So I was very appreciative of that. There's a lot of discussion about family, loyalty, love. Oh my god, just a really good book. I mean, really, really good. There's a lot of look at depression and what do you do when you have a family member who is suffering from mental illness but refuses to believe that mental illness is a real thing. And it was just such a good read. I might read this again pretty soon, I think, because I thoroughly enjoyed myself. So that concludes the books that I read in January of 2021. It was a lot. It was a lot. I don't anticipate February being quite as big of a reading month. Let me know all your thoughts in the comments below. Have you read any of these books, or would you like to read any of these books? If you're new here and you like my content, subscribe. Stick around. I'd love to see you in my comments. Thank you for watching. I hope to see you soon. Bye.